Good afternoon from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. It's a very breezy afternoon. If you can hear some of the wind noise, that's what you're hearing is the breezy conditions here on Florida Space Coast this afternoon. You're looking live at Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, about 4 miles away from our position, where SpaceX is hoping to launch a Falcon 9 rocket this afternoon as soon as 4:01 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 8:01 p.m. UTC, a little more than an hour, or about an hour away from now. That launch will be carrying another batch of 56 Starlink internet satellites into orbit. Those satellites are buttoned up for liftoff inside the payload fairing at the very top of the Falcon 9 that you're looking at now at Pad 40. The forecast going into this afternoon's countdown predicted a 60% chance of favorable weather. The primary concerns for weather this afternoon being ground winds and the potential for thick cloud cover. Well, I can tell you, here at Kennedy Space Center, one of those weather threats has not materialized. It is a mostly sunny afternoon with a lot of blue sky, some scattered high-level clouds, but not a concern for launch this afternoon. But the ground winds here are gusting to near 30 miles per hour, close to the limit for a Falcon 9 launch. So SpaceX, along with the 45th Weather Squadron from the U.S. Space Force, will be closely monitoring the wind conditions throughout the next hour to see if they're going to be acceptable for flight of the Falcon 9 rocket at 4:01 p.m. this afternoon Eastern Time. SpaceX has two backup launch opportunities later this evening at 5:43 p.m. Eastern. That's 21:43 UTC. And then a third and final launch opportunity at 7:22 p.m. just prior to sunset here on Florida Space Coast. That is at 23:22 UTC. Those opportunities available for SpaceX to use if necessary, if technical issues or the winds are not favorable for launch at the first opportunity at 4:01 p.m. Eastern Time. minus 49 minutes, 30 seconds and counting. Now inside of 50 minutes until the first of 3 launch opportunities this afternoon and this evening here at Kennedy Space Center, or at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where the Falcon 9 is vertical at this hour, awaiting liftoff, with 56 more Starlink internet satellites on board. And if you're hearing the wind noise, that's indicative of the conditions here on Florida's Space Coast. It is a breezy afternoon, winds gusting at times this afternoon greater than 30 miles per hour, very close to the limit for a Falcon 9 launch. SpaceX and the launch weather officer will be tracking the winds at the launch pad over the next few minutes before determining whether SpaceX will proceed with the countdown at the first of the 3 opportunities for launch this afternoon. Here are the 3 launch times that SpaceX has penciled in for this afternoon for Starlink 5-10. That's the mission name for today's launch. The first of those, as I mentioned, is at 4:01 p.m. Eastern Time, 20:01 UTC. The second at 5:43 p.m. Eastern Time, and the third at 7:22 p.m. Eastern Time. That would be less than 20 minutes before sunset. If you're just joining us, if you haven't done so yet, please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. That helps us attract a larger audience through the YouTube algorithm. So one way to help us out here at Spaceflight Now is to hit the thumbs up or the like button on our YouTube stream. Now 45 minutes, 48 seconds until liftoff. The next major milestone in the countdown this afternoon will be the go, no-go poll by SpaceX's launch control team. This team is stationed in SpaceX's Launch and Landing Control Center, a few miles south of the pad near the southern gate of Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Inside that room, engineers will be tracking systems on the Falcon 9 rocket, the Starlink satellites, ground systems out at Pad 40, as well as the weather. And if all looks go, they will give the go-ahead or green light to begin the terminal countdown sequence. The automated sequencer begins at T-minus 35 minutes. That's also when propellants would begin loading into the Falcon 9 for an on-time launch at 4:01 p.m. Eastern Time, 20:01 UTC. SpaceX's countdown is approaching T-minus 40 minutes. We're about 5 minutes away from the time at which SpaceX is expected to begin loading propellants into the Falcon 9 rocket, assuming they continue to target the first of the 3 launch opportunities today. The first launch opportunity is at 4:01 p.m. Eastern Time on the dot. That's 20:01 UTC. Right now, the launch readiness poll should be underway at SpaceX Launch Control to proceed into that final 35-minute countdown sequence. Once again, here are the 3 launch opportunities for this mission, which is named Starlink 5-10. The first of these is in less than 40 minutes at 4:01 p.m. Eastern Time. A second opportunity is available about an hour and 40 minutes later at 5:43 p.m. Eastern Time, and a final opportunity is at 7:22 p.m. Eastern Time, 23:22 UTC. These launch times are scheduled based on the position in the Starlink constellation that these satellites will be launched into. So there are opportunities to target different orbital planes in the Starlink constellation for these 56 satellites that are heading up to the broadband network at 4:01, 5:43, and 7:22 p.m. Eastern Time. Now 37 minutes, 30 seconds until the first launch opportunity today. Here's a look at the countdown clock and the flag here at Kennedy Space Center's press site. You can see the breezy winds coming out of the north, gusting by our measurements to more than 30 miles per hour at times this afternoon. That's close to the limit for a Falcon 9 launch. That limit and the wind conditions are being closely watched by SpaceX as they progress toward a potential launch this afternoon.
Tanks are venting for start of prop load. This is the launch director with abort instructions. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief the CE or LD and they will approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operators shall call hold on the primary countdown net. Launch control will abort the launch auto sequence immediately and proceed into the launch abort auto sequence. At T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands-off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count. And LD is go for propellant loading and launch.
So we heard a call from SpaceX Launch Control just a few moments ago that the tanks on the Falcon 9 rocket are venting for propellant load. So it sounds like the team is going to proceed for an on-time launch at 4:01 p.m. Eastern Time, 8:01 p.m. UTC. T-minus 35 minutes and counting. Propellants should now be loading into the Falcon 9.
Launch auto sequence has started.
And the launch auto sequence has started. You may have heard that on our live stream. We're piping in some audio from SpaceX Launch Control. So that confirms that the hands of the countdown, so to speak, are in the grasp of the ground launch computer, a sequencer that's overseeing all of the vital functions to prepare the Falcon 9 rocket for flight. Also controls ground systems that are managing the loading of propellants on the Falcon 9 rocket, and propellant loading is now underway. So kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants now are flowing into the two-stage Falcon 9. 3 of the 4 main propellant tanks currently are being loaded. That is the first stage kerosene fuel and liquid oxygen tank, as well as the kerosene fuel tank on stage 2. The kerosene used by the Falcon 9 rocket is a highly refined rocket-grade kerosene known as RP1. That stands for Rocket Propellant 1. It's again a highly refined kerosene that takes out a lot of the impurities that you see in commercial-grade, consumer-grade kerosene products necessary for these high-performance Merlin engines. The 9 engines on the first stage will consume the mixture of kerosene and liquid oxygen for the first 2.5 minutes of the flight, followed by several restarts on the way back to the ground for landing on a drone ship offshore. The upper stage has a single Merlin engine burning the same propellant combination. T-minus 30 minutes, 30 seconds, and counting. Today's mission is known as Starlink 5-1. It's carrying 56 Starlink internet satellites into SpaceX's commercial broadband constellation. This image here shows what the satellites look like stacked in launch configuration. This photo was taken on a previous, or before a previous Starlink launch. You can see these satellites just before encapsulation inside the payload fairing. In fact, one half of SpaceX's 43-foot tall or 17-meter tall payload fairing is visible here, about to move around the stack of Starlink satellites. These 56 satellites will provide a low latency, high-speed internet service to SpaceX's consumers. Starlink service is currently available on all 7 continents, including some testing that's underway at a scientific research station down in Antarctica for providing those research teams with high-speed internet service. These 56 satellites were built by SpaceX's Starlink assembly line in Redmond, Washington, near Seattle. Each spacecraft weighs about 660 pounds or 300 kilograms at launch. They are solar-powered with krypton-fueled ion engines. These satellites are known as the Starlink version 1.5. This is the older generation Starlink satellite. These satellites are heading up to an operational orbit of 329 miles or 530 kilometers in altitude at an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. The Falcon 9 rocket will be releasing the satellites in a lower orbit, about 300 kilometers, roughly 200 miles in altitude, and the satellites will actually use their onboard ion thrusters over the course of weeks or months to orbit raise up to 329 miles or 530 kilometers, where they will enter the operational fleet. So as I mentioned, these satellites are known as Starlink version 1.5 spacecraft. This is the older generation Starlink design that began launching a few years ago. SpaceX has already deployed their first batch of 21 upgraded satellites called the Starlink V2 Mini or version 2 Mini. These satellites, despite the name Mini, are actually much larger and heavier and more capable than the previous generation of Starlink satellites. The first 21 satellites in the Starlink V2 Mini design launched back on February the 27th from here at the Cape. The image of those satellites visible at right in this double image. Those satellites are currently undergoing commissioning and tests. SpaceX has encountered some difficulty with some of the spacecraft in that batch of 21. These are a brand new design, essentially, so they're working out issues with the satellites, not totally unexpected when you launch a brand new spacecraft platform. The new Starlink V2 Mini satellites have upgraded phased array antennas, as well as a different type of propulsion system. Instead of using krypton fuel for their ion thrusters, they use argon, which is a cheaper fuel to feed the electric thrusters for in-orbit maneuvers on the Starlink version 2 Mini satellites. So while SpaceX has ground teams worked to resolve problems that are unspecified with the Starlink version 2 Mini satellites, the company has reverted back to launching their older generation satellites in the meantime, with a launch last week that carried a batch of 56 satellites to orbit of the Starlink V1.5 iteration, and then another 56 version 1.5s going to space today from here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. These two missions last week and today were originally slated to carry more batches of Starlink V2 Mini satellites. So SpaceX has put the brakes on those plans. They've paused the deployment of the upgraded Starlink satellites and continued churning out Starlink version 1.5s for additional launches while they wait for the teething problems, so to speak, with the V2 Minis to be resolved, and then they will resume launches of the version 2 Mini satellites sometime down the road. The version 2 Mini satellites are, as I mentioned, much larger. They're about 800 kilograms versus 300 kilograms each for the Starlink version 1.5s. That means the Falcon 9 rocket can only launch about 21 or so version 2 Mini satellites in a go versus between 50 and 60 version 1.5s per mission. The version 2 Mini is an intermediate satellite design that will be superseded sometime in the coming months or years by a even larger spacecraft design called the Starlink version 2. That's the full-size second-generation Starlink satellite that is designed to launch on SpaceX's next-generation Starship rocket. Here's what a ground user terminal looks like. SpaceX has more than 1 million subscribers for consumer-grade broadband through the Starlink internet network, and their customers actually connect with the satellites as they fly overhead to receive and transmit internet signals with this flat panel antenna that you see here perched on a roof in this Starlink SpaceX publicity photo. Now less than 25 minutes until liftoff of SpaceX's 21st flight of the year. Now inside of 24 minutes until launch, you can see some of the frost building up on the Falcon 9 rocket out at pad 40 as the super cold liquid oxygen is loaded into the first stage of the Falcon 9 booster. The first stage of the Falcon 9 is powered by 9 Merlin engines, producing about 1.7 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. The first stage on this flight is making its 4th flight to space, so it has 3 flights under its belt already. It'll be landed on a drone ship after this mission, 8.5 minutes after launch, for recovery and reuse. Above the first stage is the interstage adapter. That's a carbon fiber structure that actually comes back to Earth with the first stage of the Falcon 9. In this inset image, you can see the deployable hypersonic grid fins. These are titanium winglets that provide stability and some steering support for the Falcon 9's descent back through the atmosphere. It comes back through the atmosphere like a dart, essentially, tail first, diving back to Earth, and then uses its a subset of its 9 engines to slow down for landing on the drone ship. Inside the interstage adapter on the launch pad is the upper stage engine. The upper stage is powered by a single modified Merlin engine called a Merlin vacuum engine, or MVAC engine. The MVAC engine produces more than 200,000 pounds of thrust. It'll be ignited 2 times on today's flight to deploy the 56 Starlink satellites into orbit. The MVAC engine burns the same propellant mix, kerosene and liquid oxygen, as the first stage. There'll be a third ignition of the upper stage engine after the deployment of the 56 Starlink satellites. That'll be a deorbit burn to steer the upper stage back into the atmosphere to burn up, and that is a measure to eliminate the risk of creating any unnecessary space debris on this mission. And then at the very top of the 229-foot tall, or 70-meter tall Falcon 9 is the payload fairing. Inside the payload fairing are the 56 satellites stacked one on top of the other, flat packed in launch configuration, held down onto the launch pad, onto the rocket rather, by 4 metallic retention rods. Those rods will actually be jettisoned from the rocket once it's in the proper orbit for separation about an hour after liftoff, and that will allow the 56 Starlink satellites to fly free of the rocket. The payload fairing itself is also reusable, and SpaceX has a recovery boat downrange, just a little farther downrange than the drone ship for the first stage landing, northeast of the Bahamas, where they will fish the 2 halves of the payload fairing out of the water. After they splash down into parachutes, they'll bring them back to Cape Canaveral for refurbishment and reuse. Now 21 minutes until liftoff. If you're just joining us, my name is Stephen Clark. I'm editor of SpaceflightNow.com. providing live updates on the countdown for SpaceX's Starlink 5-10 mission. If you haven't done so yet, please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. That helps us attract more viewers to our launch coverage as we get closer to liftoff. The next milestone we expect to see out at Pad 40 will be the so-called big vent. It'll be a vent of gaseous oxygen that comes from the strong back, which is the structure just to the right of the Falcon 9 rocket as it sits out on Pad 40. That's a preparatory step for the beginning of the loading of liquid oxygen onto the second stage. Now we're seeing that big vent underway at Pad 40. Also at this time, the second stage should be fully loaded with kerosene fuel.
Stage 2 RP1 load is complete.
And we just heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the kerosene tank on the second stage is indeed full. So the first of the 4 propellant tanks to be loaded this afternoon has been filled for flight. This vent is a step to prepare for loading of liquid oxygen on the second stage. The liquid oxygen is chilled down to a temperature of several hundred degrees below zero. And this vent is part of the chill down process to thermally condition the line that leads from the ground storage tank for liquid oxygen up to the umbilical connection on stage 2. This is a step to condition that line for the flow of liquid oxygen, cryogenic fluid, to load into stage 2. Now about 18 minutes until liftoff. Let's take a look at the countdown timeline for today's mission. We've already passed a few of these milestones. Propellant loading began as expected at T-minus 35 minutes. Liquid oxygen loading will begin on stage 2 in about 2 minutes. The chill down of the strong back transfer line is currently underway at Pad 40 before loading of liquid oxygen begins on stage 2. At T-minus 7 minutes, the Merlin engines, the 9 kerosene-fueled power plants at the very bottom of the Falcon 9 rocket will begin their chill down process. This chill down is a thermal conditioning effort to make sure that the engines are at the proper temperature for ignition. This involves flowing a little bit of the super cold liquid oxygen through the engines to protect those elements from the risk of thermal shock and damage during the startup sequence. At T-minus 5.5 minutes or 6 minutes or so, the first stage kerosene tank should be full. And then at 4.5 minutes, we expect to see the strong back begin retracting from the Falcon 9 rocket. It'll recline to an angle of about 1.5 degrees, leaning back ever so slightly from the Falcon 9. That'll stay there until liftoff, and then at liftoff, that strong back will be seen swinging in a more rapid fashion, a more rapid pullback of the strong back at liftoff to clear the way for the vertical climb of the Falcon 9 off the pad. At about 2 minutes, the Falcon 9 liquid oxygen loading should be complete. At that point, SpaceX will have a fully loaded Falcon 9 rocket with 1 million pounds of propellant on board. It'll weigh about 1.2 million pounds fully loaded. That includes the propellant mass and the structural mass of the Falcon 9. And then at T-minus 60 seconds, the control of the countdown will be handed over from the ground computer to the Falcon 9's onboard flight computer.
Box load has started.
We just heard a call that the Stage 2 liquid oxygen load has started. And then in the final 60 seconds of the countdown, the propellant tanks will be brought up to flight pressure. The SpaceX launch director will give their go for liftoff, and then the engine ignition command will be issued at T-minus 3 seconds. If all 9 engines ignite and are healthy, the flight computer will give the command to release hold-down clamps to release the Falcon 9 for flight at T0. The Falcon 9 will be heading downrange to the southeast on today's mission with the 56 Starlink internet satellites on board. We saw the big vent end. It terminated right as the liquid oxygen loading started on stage 2 out at pad 40. This will be the 17th launch attempt of the year from here on Florida Space Coast. This counts orbital launch attempts from Kennedy Space Center and from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Most of these missions, the 16 launches to date this year, 15 of them have been SpaceX missions. There was also one launch attempt that failed to achieve orbit by the company Relativity Space earlier this month. You can see in this chart the growth in launch activity here on Florida Space Coast over the last 20 years, primarily due to SpaceX's activity. T-minus 15 minutes and counting. No issues reported so far in the countdown. It remains quite breezy here at Cape Canaveral, but the team is optimistic enough to proceed with the countdown, optimistic that the wind conditions will be acceptable at launch time. T-minus 13 minutes and counting. If you haven't done so yet, please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream as we get down in the final 13 minutes to liftoff. We want to get as many viewers and interested people watching as possible. And to help us do that, you can hit the thumbs up or the like button here on YouTube. That helps us attract more viewers interested in watching this mission, which will deliver 56 more Starlink internet satellites into orbit. T-minus 12 minutes and counting. Let's take a look at the expected flight path for the Falcon 9 rocket after it departs from pad 40 at 4:01 p.m. Eastern Time, or 20:01 UTC. In this map, we've noted the ground track for the Falcon 9 as it heads southeast from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. We've labeled here Slick 40. That's Space Launch Complex 40, the departure point for today's mission. The red line here shows the expected ground track of the first stage of the Falcon 9 as it makes its way on an arcing ballistic trajectory toward the drone ship. Just read the instructions. It's a football field-sized platform floating roughly 410 miles or 660 kilometers downrange northeast of the Bahamas. The green line here shows the flight path of the second stage. After stage separation, roughly 2.5 minutes after liftoff, the first stage, while it's making its descent back to the drone ship, the second stage will ignite its single engine, and accelerate up to orbital velocity, some 17,000 miles an hour. The green line here shows the flight path that upper stage will take, just flying off the coast of the Bahamas, heading out north of the Turks and Caicos Islands, and then east of Puerto Rico, ultimately over the Caribbean Sea and South America. The upper stage will vector its thrust just slightly to make a small right-hand turn. That's called a dogleg maneuver. This maneuver will ensure there's no direct overflight or risk of debris falling on the Bahamas on today's mission, heading for an orbital inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. And here's a look at the major flight events for this mission. It'll take about a minute for the Falcon 9 to exceed the speed of sound. Once it's supersonic, a few moments later, it'll pass a maximum aerodynamic pressure, or max Q. That's the peak structural loads on the vehicle during its acceleration through the thick lower layers of the atmosphere. 2 minutes 28 seconds into the flight, we'll see main engine cutoff on the first stage. Those 9 engines will shut down. That'll be followed by stage separation at 2 minutes 31 seconds. And then ignition of the single engine on stage 2 at 2 minutes 38 seconds. At 2 minutes 46 seconds, we should see the payload fairing jettison from the nose of the Falcon 9 rocket. That'll reveal the 56 Starlink satellites to the space environment for the first time. And then the first stage will make its return maneuvers. It'll control itself using cold gas thrusters, orient itself to a tail-first orientation, extend the titanium grid fins, and then reignite 3 of its engines for a so-called entry burn. That'll be a braking maneuver to slow down for re-entry through the atmosphere, and then a final burn using its single engine, just one of the 9 engines firing to slow down for landing on the drone ship about 8 minutes and 24 seconds into the flight. Meanwhile, the second stage will fire its engine for about 6 minutes, all while these recovery maneuvers are going on stage 1. And we should have the 56 Starlink satellites into a parking orbit at 8 minutes 37 seconds. It'll coast halfway around the world over the Indian Ocean. 54 minutes into the flight, it'll be a very short relight of stage 2, and that will place the 56 Starlink satellites into their planned near circular orbit for deployment, and separation of the 56 Starlink satellites will be occurring about a minute, or about an hour and 5 minutes after launch this afternoon. 8 minutes, 20 seconds now remaining in the countdown. Now approaching the T-minus 7 minute mark, that's when the engine chill down on the first stage should get underway. As I mentioned earlier in our coverage, this is when the 9 Merlin engines on stage 1 will begin to be thermally conditioned for flight. This involves flowing just a small amount of liquid oxygen through the engine plumbing to protect those pieces of hardware from the risk of damage from thermal shock. Again, this liquid oxygen is chilled to several hundred degrees below zero. It's quite cold. We just heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control now that the engine chill down has started right on time.
Stage 1 RP load is complete.
inside of 6 minutes until liftoff. SpaceX's countdown now approaching the T-minus 5 minute mark. At this point, the rocket should be fully loaded with its entire supply of kerosene fuel. This RP-1 fuel is now fully loaded on both stages of the Falcon 9 rocket. The next thing we expect to see is the retraction of the strongback from pad 40.
Tanks are pressing for strongback retract.
Preparations underway for retraction of the strongback. We just heard from SpaceX launch control. Clamps will open from around the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket, allowing this structure to recline to an angle of about 1.5 degrees. That positions the umbilical connections at the right angle for engine start and liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket. 4 minutes, 20 seconds to go.
Strongback lower has started.
And the strongback retraction just started, according to SpaceX. Also in the last few minutes, final checks of the autonomous flight safety system, the destruct mechanism on the Falcon 9 rocket have been completed, as well as final checks of the navigation system. This is all done through the automated countdown sequencer, the computer governing the final 35 minutes of launch preps. T-minus 3 minutes.
Stage 1 LOX load is complete.
Here's a look at the flight history for this Falcon 9 booster, booster number 1077 in SpaceX's fleet. It's making its 4th flight to space after 3 previous missions in October, in January, and just last month, most recently on February the 17th. It's launched a cargo mission to the space station, a Space Force GPS satellite, and a commercial communications satellite for Inmarsat. And here's a look at the target orbit for today's mission. The Falcon 9's computer will be targeting an orbit 185 miles by 210 miles in altitude at an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. T-minus 2 minutes and counting. Back to a full screen shot of pad 40, showing the Falcon 9 now fully loaded with about 1 million pounds of kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants.
Stage 2 LOX load is complete.
Coming up on T-minus 90 seconds. Control of the countdown will be handed from the ground computer off to the flight computer on the Falcon 9
Ground gas closeouts has started.
at T-minus 1 minute.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
Now 45 seconds until liftoff. The Falcon 9's flight computer now in control of the countdown. Propellant tanks will be brought up to flight pressure in the next few moments. Vent valves should now be closed for flight.
Go for launch.
The launch director just gave their final go for liftoff. 30 seconds now until launch of SpaceX's 21st flight of 2023. T-minus 20 seconds. T-minus 15. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine ignition and liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket on the Starlink 5-10 mission. Falcon 9 has cleared the lightning towers at pad 40. The rocket is now heading downrange on a path to the southeast from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. T plus 30 seconds. Let's listen to the Merlin engines. One minute, 20 seconds into the flight. Falcon 9 is now supersonic. It's also past the point of maximum aerodynamic pressure, or max Q. 90 seconds into the flight. The 9 Merlin engines producing 1.7 million pounds of thrust. About a minute left in their burn. We've heard a call now that the engine chill down is underway on the second stage engine. This is a thermal conditioning step to prepare the engine to light after stage separation. Now 30 seconds until main engine cutoff. We're now switching over to an onboard view from SpaceX's rocket cam. This aft-facing camera shows the exhaust plume from the 9 Merlin engines. The feed from SpaceX comes with about a 10-second delay, so these scenes you're seeing are occurring a few seconds later than real time. Standing by for main engine cutoff. We've heard the call for main engine cutoff, confirmed. And there's staging. The booster now falling away from the second stage of the Falcon 9. And we see ignition of the MVAC engine. The upper stage now firing to accelerate to orbital velocity, standing by for payload fairing separation.
Fairing separation confirmed.
And there's payload fairing separation. You can see the limb of the Earth on the right, and the 56 Starlink satellites now exposed to the environment of space for the first time at an altitude of 92 kilometers and climbing, passing 8,500 kilometers per hour velocity on stage 2. The first stage on the left in this camera has extended its 4 titanium grid fins and will be arcing to a high point of its trajectory just beyond the internationally recognized boundary of space in the next few moments, and then will begin its descent back to Earth as the gravity pulls the booster back through the atmosphere for landing. 3 minutes, 45 seconds into the flight. All calls so far from SpaceX indicate a good start to the Starlink 5-10 mission. 4 minutes, 20 seconds into the flight. Everything looking good so far. Booster is now at 116 kilometers altitude, near the high point of its trajectory before beginning its descent back to Earth. The upper stage now at 140 kilometers altitude, roughly. And a downrange tracking station in Bermuda now is receiving signals from the Falcon 9.
Both vehicles continue to follow nominal trajectories.
Next major milestone in the mission will be the entry burn on the first stage booster. You should see that on the left-hand view here from SpaceX's onboard camera, looking toward the rear of that 15-story tall first stage. And there's ignition. Entry burn now underway. This will run about 20 seconds using 3 of its 9 engines to slow down. See the velocity in the lower left decreasing rapidly as the 3 engines impart some thrust on the rocket to reduce its velocity. And there's entry burn shutdown on stage 1.
Stage 1 entry burn shutdown. Stage 2 FTS is saved.
Both vehicles continue to follow nominal trajectories.
Now about a minute away from the landing burn on the first stage of the Falcon 9. That'll be a final burn using the center engine, just one of the 9 engines firing to slow for landing on the drone ship. Just read the instructions, parked about 410 miles or 660 kilometers downrange from here at the Cape. That is northeast of the Bahamas for the location of the drone ship for today's landing. Landing is expected at plus 8 minutes, 24 seconds. Around the same time as the second stage engine, which you see on the right, ends its burn to place the 56 Starlink satellites into a preliminary parking orbit.
Stage 2 has entered terminal guidance.
Standing by for the landing burn, and there's landing burn ignition. Drone ship now coming into view in this camera view from the stage 1 booster. Grid fins at work, steering the booster toward its target.
Landing leg deploy. Stage 1 landing confirmed.
And there's the call from SpaceX confirming what you see visually, a good landing of the first stage on the drone ship. Just read the instructions, completing booster number 1077's 4th flight to space.
MVAC shutdown.
And we just heard a call now for MVAC shutdown. That's confirming that the upper stage engine has cut off, stopped firing after reaching orbit.
Nominal orbit insertion.
Expect to also signal Cape.
Nine minutes, 35 seconds into the flight, we just heard a couple of calls from SpaceX Launch Control, confirming that the upper stage has placed the 56 Starlink satellites into their expected parking orbit. This is an elliptical or elongated shaped transfer orbit. Another burn of the upper stage engine is planned at 54 minutes into the flight. That will be a maneuver to put the satellites into a more circular orbit, setting up for deployment of the 56 Starlink satellites at T+1 hour and 5 minutes, about 55 minutes from now. You see in this map, the first stage is now parked on the drone ship after its successful landing. The second stage of the Falcon 9 screaming through space, so to speak. Obviously, they're in a vacuum of space, but the second stage heading down range, continuing in orbit at a velocity of 17,000 miles per hour over the Caribbean Sea. It'll be heading off the coast of South America, clipping the northeastern states of Brazil before heading out again over the central Atlantic. So another hour or so to go in today's Starlink 5-10 mission, but certainly a great start. We saw a successful liftoff of the Falcon 9 from here at Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral, Florida, as well as an on-target landing of booster 1077 on the drone ship in the Atlantic Ocean. T+11 minutes into the Starlink 5-10 mission. Now 12 minutes into the flight, let's take a look at the mission stats for today's mission. This Starlink 5-10 mission marked the 214th launch of a Falcon 9 rocket since the very first Falcon 9 launch back in 2010. This was the 224th flight overall of a Falcon launch vehicle. This includes Falcon 1s, Falcon 9s, and Falcon Heavies. Since the very first Falcon 1 launch attempt in 2006, these tallies account any Falcon 9, Falcon 1, or Falcon Heavy launch, whether it achieved orbit or not. This is the fourth flight of this booster, Booster 1077, which we saw land on the drone ship a few minutes ago. This was the 183rd SpaceX launch from here in Florida, the 119th SpaceX launch from Pad 40, and the 174th launch overall from Space Launch Complex 40 at the Cape, including Falcon 9 missions, as well as its previous history as the home of the Air Force's Titan rocket program, dating back to 1965. Some additional stats: this was the 154th flight of a reused Falcon 9 booster. The landing we saw on the drone ship of this first stage was the 182nd landing of a Falcon booster, including Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy missions. This was the 79th SpaceX launch, primarily dedicated to the Starlink Internet Network, the 21st SpaceX launch of this year, and the 17th orbital launch attempt from launch pads at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station or Kennedy Space Center so far this year. That 17 launch figure includes 16 flights by SpaceX and 1 launch attempt by Relativity Space. Before we sign off our coverage, we want to look ahead at the launch calendar over the next couple of weeks. SpaceX will be back in action tomorrow morning from Vandenberg Space Force Base out in California. A Falcon 9 rocket is set for liftoff during a launch window opening at 10:29 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 7:29 a.m. Pacific Time, local time, out at Vandenberg Space Force Base. Also translates to 1429 UTC for those of you wishing to tune in from around the world. The Falcon 9 will take off from Space Launch Complex 4 East, head to the south with 10 satellites for the U.S. military's Space Development Agency. These are the first set of prototypes for a planned constellation of hundreds of data relay and missile tracking satellites that the Space Development Agency plans to deploy over the next few years. These 10 satellites will be put through some testing over the coming months to verify that the architecture that the SDA has developed will work, and then there will be more launches with more satellites for the Space Development Agency over the next couple of years. This launch tomorrow will include a return of the Falcon 9 booster back to landing zone 4 at Vandenberg, so we'll see a return to launch site landing of the first stage tomorrow morning, just after sunrise out in California. On April the 7th, next week, will be the next SpaceX launch from here in Florida with a communications satellite for Intelsat. This Intelsat 40E satellite will take off from Pad 40, the same launch pad we saw used today. It'll carry a hosted payload and instrument package called Tempo for NASA on the spacecraft to monitor air quality over the United States in daytime hours for the next few years. That's part of NASA's Earth Science Division program. And then on April the 9th, another Falcon 9 is scheduled for launch from Vandenberg Space Force Base on SpaceX's 7th small satellite rideshare mission called Transporter 7. This mission will have dozens of small satellites on board for commercial, international, and government customers heading up into polar orbit. That mission will also have a return to launch site landing of the first stage, so Vandenberg has some exciting launches ahead with back-to-back RTLS missions, return to launch site missions that they'll see landing of the first stage back on shore at Vandenberg Space Force Base. And then the next big launch after that we're monitoring is scheduled for April the 13th. This will be the second to last launch of Europe's Ariane 5 rocket, carrying the European Space Agency's Jupiter Icy Moons Explorer, or JUICE mission, on a nearly decade-long journey to orbit Jupiter and fly by Jupiter's icy moons. This European Space Agency mission will launch from the Guiana Space Center down in Kourou, French Guiana on April the 13th. So we'll be covering these launches either on our YouTube channel, which you're watching now, or we'll have coverage on our website at www.spaceflightnow.com. If you want to support our coverage as we continue to bring you live events like this one, you can do so by hitting the join button here on our YouTube channel. If you join our YouTube channel, depending on which membership level you select, you can gain access to bonus members-only video features that we have produced just for our supporters, and you'll be helping us maintain our equipment, helping us get out here to the Cape for every launch, and helping us monitor the ever-growing pace of launch activity around the world. We've been doing this since 1999, and your loyal support keeps us going. So any support you can provide, any contribution by joining our YouTube channel or in our Super Chat here on our YouTube channel goes a long way, and we really appreciate that support because that's what keeps us going. Now 18 minutes since launch, we'll leave you with one last look of Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where the Falcon 9 took off 18 minutes ago. We're going to continue some periodic updates over on our Launchpad Live channel, on our Launchpad Live stream here on our Spaceflight Now channel. We'll have more updates there on the progress of this mission. A couple of major events still to come. In less than an hour, we expect to hear confirmation of the restart of the second stage engine for a crucial maneuver to place these Starlink satellites into the proper orbit for deployment, which will occur at 1 hour and 5 minutes after liftoff. We'll have the tracking map as well as some periodic updates on their Launchpad Live stream here on our YouTube channel. I want to thank Stephen Young for providing video support and production support today. My name is Stephen Clark. I'm editor of Spaceflight Now. Thanks for joining us for our live coverage of the Starlink 5-10 mission. We'll see you next time.